Hi, welcome to Daily Dose of Anime Recaps. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the series Monster Girl Doctor. A young male doctor lives in a society where monsters and humans live together, and he is an expert in treating the monster girls. Whenever he treats a monster girl, they flirt with him and try to get closer to him. The young doctor also has an assistant who is a monster girl, and she too likes him a lot. Will the assistant be able to keep the female patients away from the doctor? Or will the doctor also lose control and fall for any one of them? Before we begin, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next episodes. The episode opens up with a narration about a war between humans and monsters that continued for about 100 years. The narrator mentions that the soldiers from both sides were so exhausted that they even forgot the reason why they were fighting against each other. Eventually, both sides reconcile and decide to end the war and maintain peace. Following this, slowly and steadily, the humans and monsters start interacting with one another and living together in the same community. The scene then shifts toward a clinic where Dr. Glenn, a young doctor, is inspecting a female centaur's breasts in search of lumps. The centaur cannot handle the sensations caused when Dr. Glenn runs his hands around her breasts and moans for a while. After not finding any lumps, Dr. Glenn starts looking at her ears. Soon, he completes the checkup and comes up with a conclusion that the centaur is actually pregnant, and the aches she was feeling in her chest and her ears are all because of the pregnancy. As soon as he says this, the husband of the centaur, a monster, runs into the clinic and hugs his wife. Here, we get to know that the female monsters are beautiful and are only half monster, but the male ones are complete monsters. Saphentite Neikes, a half-snake assistant for Dr. Glenn, also approaches the centaur and congratulates her on the pregnancy. After completing the checkups for the day, Saphentite talks to Dr. Glenn and suggests he should be aware of the people around him while checking up on a patient. She also requests him to call her Sapphy, like he used to call her during their academy days. While the two are conversing, someone arrives at the door and calls the doctor. Dr. Glenn rushes to the door to meet the man and receives a special delivery from him. Soon, he opens it and finds a letter from the central hospital written by his senior, Dr. Thule, asking him to visit the nearby arena and treat the patients while she is away. Without wasting any time, Dr. Glenn and Saphentite leave for the arena, and on the way, Dr. Glenn mentions that it's Dr. Thule who has their back and supports them while opening their clinic on their own. He seems very excited to work for Dr. Thule and interact with numerous of her patients, while Saphentite hates Dr. Thule for asking them to come so far just to help her. Here, it is revealed that Dr. Thule is also a monster with a half-monster, half-human appearance. In the next scene, the two doctors arrive at the arena and prepare to treat the patients. Following this, a female centaur approaches them with other athletes for treatment. The centaur introduces herself as Thessalia Scythia, who was also the only princess of Scythia transportation. She acts as a leader and asks other athletes to remain in a queue as the checkup will be conducted in order. Moving on, the checkup begins and each of the female athletes starts flirting with Dr. Glenn, praising him for working at an early age. When it's Thessalia's turn, she too undresses for the checkup and flirts with him, mentioning her will to marry a perfect man. She continues by saying that she has been searching for a perfect husband, but hasn't been able to find anyone. Seeing her flirt with Dr. Glenn, Saphentite intervenes and tells Thessalia that she has gained weight in recent weeks. This makes Thessalia divert her attention from Dr. Glenn, and she starts arguing with Saphentite. She claims that her waist is perfectly fine and in good shape. She even belittles Saphentite and criticizes her way of holding and treating patients. However, Dr. Glenn declares that Thessalia is perfectly fine and has no abnormalities. Later in the evening, while Dr. Glenn and Saphentite are preparing to return home, two of Thessalia's assistants, Lorna and Kay, approach Dr. Glenn and ask him if Thessalia is perfectly fine. Dr. Glenn thinks for a while and remains adamant about his previous declaration about Thessalia. Despite this, he asks Lorna and Kay why they are saying so. Lorna then tells Dr. Glenn that they are worried about Thessalia a lot because she's failed to win a single match since last month. Because of the decrease in her win percentage, Thessalia has started taking the stress and always appears tired. At night, Dr. Glenn is still thinking about why he was unable to find out the actual problem of Thessalia. While he is doubting his checkup skills, Saphentite arrives there and asks him to take a rest. She also offers him a refreshing drink and promises to accompany him on his visit to Thessalia's next match. It's clear that Saphentite has a love love interest in Dr. Glenn, but the doctor only thinks of her as a friend and a colleague. The following day, Dr. Glenn and Saphentite visit the arena and watch Thessalia live during one of her matches with Catwoman. Sadly, Thessalia again loses the match, and it's her 10th loss in a row. With a gloomy face, she returns to her chamber and begins practicing for her next match. Right then, Dr. Glenn arrives there with Lorna and Kay and informs them that he has finally found out what her problem is. At first, Thessalia is eager to know about it, but when Dr. Glenn mentions that the real problem is her hooves, she refuses to do anything about it. However, Lorna and Kay hold Thessalia tight, and Dr. Glenn soon begins his treatment. He removes and sharpens each of her hooves gently and places a metal horseshoe on each of them. Despite Thessalia stating that she's perfectly fine, Dr. Glenn does not listen to her and continues his work till he finishes putting iron hooves on each of her legs, which was the main reason she was losing her balance during the competition. When Thessalia tries to restrain herself and starts making noise, Saphentite also arrives there and apprehends Thessalia in the most inappropriate way possible. After the treatment of the hooves, Thessalia performs well in her next match and wins it, making everyone happy. She thanks Dr. Glenn for his help and is now overjoyed to get back on her winning streak. In the next scene, we are shown a short story about how a half-snake monster, Saphentite, and Dr. Glenn met each other. It is during the time of the war between humans and monsters. Saphentite was brought to Glenn's family as a hostage. She was bound to stay there to assure that the contract her father made with the humans won't get betrayed. She stayed with Glenn's family for a year, and the two became really good friends. Sadly, after the war ended, Saphentite was forced to return to her home, leaving Glenn with teary eyes. Both of them were very sad to get separated from each other. To their good luck, the two happened to attend the same university to pursue their medical studies, and again stumble upon one another. Since then, Dr. Glenn and Saphentite are together, and the two love each other's company. Back in the present, Saphentite mentions purchasing some purified water and thinks of asking the doctor to accompany her to the market. Right then, Dr. Glenn also arrives at her room and suggests they go out to get some supplies. Without thinking twice, Saphentite also quickly agrees to his request. Next, the two can be seen arriving at Marrow Waterway District and are ready for the shopping. Saphentite seems very excited, and Dr. Glenn reminds her not to do unnecessary shopping. Together, they roam around the place in a boat and are mesmerized by the beauty of the place. Saphentite then mentions that the place consumed a lot of the city's budget and is a heaven for the monsters who live in water. Soon, they make a stop at their regular shop and buy some purified water, wine, and vinegar. After this, Dr. Glenn suggests they return home, but Saphentite insists on visiting other places. After going through a couple of other shops, Saphentite and Dr. Glenn decide to return home. While they're on their way back, Merfolk, the half-mermaid, half-human lady, calls them a perfect couple and invites them to visit her shop. Saphentite becomes happy after hearing the girl calling them a couple and looks at Dr. Glenn. Though Dr. Glenn refuses at first, Saphentite forces him to take her to the shop, and he reluctantly agrees. Soon, the two approach the shop of the Merfolk, and she introduces herself as Lulala. Lulala informs them that her songs are preferred by lovers, and she charges 3 copper coins for each song. Having no other choices left, Dr. Glenn pays Lulala for a song, but asks her to sing 2 of them. Hearing this, Lulala gets enraged at first, but when Dr. Glenn tells her that he will pay for her next song by treating her in his clinic, she agrees. Moving on, Lulala starts singing with her beautiful voice, but suddenly stops in the middle of her song due to some problem with her throat. Seeing her struggling, Dr. Glenn offers to treat her and take her to a silent place. He asks her to open her mouth and notices some blisters near the inner part of her throat. He then starts deducing the real reason for her problem with singing and proceeds on checking on her gills. As she is a merfolk, she's supposed to spend most of her time in the water rather than on land. When he puts his fingers inside her gills to check, he finds them dry and comes to the conclusion that it is due to Lulala spending the majority of her time outside the water. When he asks Lulala about the same, she answers that she spends about 12 to 14 hours outside water, waiting for customers to show up and singing songs for them. She also mentions that she is forced to do so because her father ran away and she has to look after her mother and her 3 siblings. Meanwhile, a human child falls into the water and screams for help. Without thinking about her critical condition, Lulala jumps in the water and swims towards the child. She successfully rescues the child, but in the process loses her strength. While the doctor is performing CPR on the child, Lulala cannot hold herself and slips back into the water. Surprisingly, she loses consciousness consciousness and starts drowning. After the CPR, the child gains consciousness, but Saphentite looks for Lulala and informs the doctor when she doesn't see her around. Dr. Glenn then immediately jumps into the water and finds Lulala drowning because of her infection in the gills. He quickly holds her and gives her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to help her breathe from her gills. After a couple of failed attempts, Lulala finally starts breathing from her gills. In the meantime, Saphentite arrives above them and pulls both of them to the boat, saving their lives. While on the boat, she notices Dr. Glenn hugging Lulala and yells at him to leave her alone. Dr. Glenn tries to explain the situation, but Saphentite refuses to listen to him. In the last scene, we can see Lulala singing in the Central Park, with a lot of visitors listening to her song and liking her voice. Among the crowd, there are Dr. Glenn and Saphentite, who are there to check up on her health. The episode ends with Saphentite confronting Dr. Glenn for giving mouth-to-mouth to Lulala and asking him to stay away from her. However, Lulala is very grateful for Dr. Glenn's actions and promises to take care of her health.